Opinions. We all have them. We all enjoy expressing them, both in person and online. But what happens when we take our opinions too seriously? What happens when we treat those opinions as facts and criticize anyone who disagrees, even people who are well versed in those opinions? This is what author Tom Nichols refers to as the death of expertise, or, quote, a rejection of science and dispassionate rationality, which are the foundations of modern civilization, closed quote. Throughout his book, The Death of Expertise, Professor Nichols analyzes the relationship between average people and professionals, specifically how that relationship has been strained by the recent trend of public distrust in experts, how people will attack and refuse to listen to expert advice, believing as though they know better. Quote, any assertion of expertise from an actual expert, meanwhile, produces an explosion of anger from certain quarters of the American public, who immediately complain that such claims are nothing more than fallacious appeals to authority, sure signs of dreadful elitism, and an obvious effort to use credentials to stifle the dialogue required by a real democracy. Close quote. The book proposes that this sense of intellectual superiority is one of America's biggest problems today, and that it has spread into various aspects of our society. Ultimately, Nichols raises the question, is resistance to knowledge furthering America's divide? In short, yes. He demonstrates this problem and its scope by explaining its three main causes: the lack of education, the media's power to misinform, and the power of belief. In today's world, education is one of the most competitive industries in America. From the enormous costs of tuition to the strict requirements of certain schools to attend. But the larger issue lies in students' attitudes towards that education, mainly college students. For example, a lot of students will go to college just to goof off and not learn. Quote, parents of students at Brown University, for example, are shelling out some serious money so their children can take part in things like Campus Nudity Week. One female Brown participant said in 2013 that the negative feedback about the event has helped prepare her for life after college. One can only hope. Close quote. Essentially, students are wasting time and money, and as a result, learn little to nothing by the time they graduate. Quote, a 2011 University of Chicago study found that America's college students failed to make significant gains in critical thinking and complex reasoning during their first 4 years of college. But more worrisome, they also failed to develop dispositions associated with civic engagement. Close quote. This can be blamed not only on students' lack of desire to commit to their education, but also on the college system. A recent pattern Nichols notes is that colleges have been thriving on consumerism, giving out degrees willy-nilly without determining if students have acquired the knowledge that said degree merits. Quote, the very best national universities, the traditional sources of university faculty, are promiscuously pumping out PhDs at a rate far higher than any academic job market can possibly absorb. Lesser schools that have no business offering advanced degrees, and many of which barely qualify as glorified high schools, even at the undergraduate level, offer doctorates of such low quality that they themselves would never hire their own graduates. Close quote. This in turn leads students to think they can get away with cheating the system, going so far as to demand that professors pass them even if they're failing. Quote, I've had graduate students tell me that if they did not get an A in my class, their lesser grade would be evidence of poor instruction on my part. Close quote. Administrators and parents of students will even encourage this behavior. Quote, a junior high school teacher in Maryland captured the essence of this problem 2 decades later in a 2014 article she published in the Washington Post, after she decided to quit her profession. She said that her school administration gave her 2 instructions that to her were defining slogans of public education. One was that students were not allowed to fail. The other foreshadowed the client-centered approach to college. If they have D's or F's, there is something that you are not doing for them. These parents who defend and coddle their children even into high school and college, doing their homework for them, but the Stanford dean politely calls this overhelping and in general participating in every aspect of their child's life. Close quote. This sense of entitlement and superiority is not only prevalent in the classroom, but even more so online. The fact that the media influences public opinion is nothing new, but with the unchecked growth of social media, the problem has only worsened. Quote, attacks on established knowledge have a long pedigree, and the internet is only the most recent tool in a recurring problem that in the past misused television, radio, the printing press, and other innovations the same way." Close quote. The most obvious example of this is the spread of clickbait, aka fake news. Countless articles and videos are shared and viewed every day on various social media apps, especially Facebook and Twitter, many of them without being fact-checked. Quote, "When it comes to urban legends, like Barack Obama's African birth, George W. Bush's orchestration of the 9/11 terror attacks, or the U.S. Treasury's secret plan to replace the dollar with a global currency, astronauts with cameras cannot help. Social media, websites, and chat rooms turn myths, stories heard from a friend of a friend, and rumors into facts." Close quote. Regardless of the validity of such information, people have a natural tendency to believe whatever they see and hear, because, as humans, we find it easier to believe rather than think critically, a skill that is crucial to the separation of good and bad knowledge. This passive acceptance among lay people is also exploited by the news media. Quote, "In 2014, the online journal Vox, which bills itself as a source that explains complicated issues to everyone else, listed 11 crucial facts to understand the Israel-Gaza crisis. Fact number 1 included the Gaza-West Bank bridge. It doesn't exist. Vox corrected its error. The writer claimed he'd seen an article about a proposed bridge, but didn't realize it was never built, but not before critics had a good laugh at Vox's expense." Close quote. Though the story didn't gain much national attention, it was a hoax regardless, and hoaxes have captured the public imagination more than once, because people find them more intriguing than the official explanation. One of the biggest internet hoaxes of recent years was the vaccines cause autism story. Quote, "In a more dramatic case, Andrew Wakefield, a doctor who published a controversial study linking vaccines and autism, had his medical license revoked. Wakefield's supporters argued that he was the victim of a witch hunt." Close quote. Once again, human nature took over, and Dr. Wakefield's supporters just assumed he was right simply because he was a doctor. Because lay people wrongly assume that if someone has a degree or title, that automatically makes them a genius. In reality, experts are not always correct. Sometimes they can miscalculate a hypothesis or even lie about their knowledge. Quote, "A more common but subtler kind of deception occurs when people who are actual experts augment their credentials with false honors or exaggerations. They might claim to be members of professional associations, or to have attended panels or symposia, or to be honorees or prize winners, or other embellishments that are in fact fraudulent." Close quote. But again, we tend to think that those with authority are always truthful because that's how we are raised. We don't cultivate our beliefs ourselves, they are taught to us. In adolescence, we take after our parents a lot. As infants, we spend unlimited time with them, and through that, we observe and copy them. Then, as we grow older, we adopt their views and beliefs, because we assume that our elders are never wrong. Politics is a good example of this. Quote, "A 2014 Pew Research study found that liberals are more likely than conservatives to block or unfriend people with whom they disagreed, but mostly because conservatives already tended to have fewer people with whom they disagreed in their online social circles in the first place." Close quote. If you have left-wing parents, you'll most likely become a left-winger yourself. Same with right-wing families. In other words, we adapt to an environment and mindset which we're comfortable in, one we're used to. Then, when someone or something challenges that, our knee-jerk reaction is defiance. Quote, "When confronted by hard evidence that they're wrong, some people will simply double down on their original assertion rather than accept their error. This is the backfire effect, in which people redouble their efforts to keep their own internal narrative consistent, no matter how clear the indications that they're wrong." Close quote. This is cognitive dissonance in a nutshell, or, quote, "the state of discomfort felt when two or more modes of thought contradict each other." Close quote. Basically, we deny a belief or fact if it opposes our own. Quote, "CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and the major networks all have excellent news organizations, and yet all of them engage in bias to some extent, if only to tailor their broadcasts to the demographic they're seeking. In the competition for viewers, simply putting news on television isn't enough. Fox's influence is larger because of the sheer size of its audience, but all of the networks now feature partisan infotainment in their schedules. The bigger problem on all of the major networks is that the transition from news to entertainment is almost seamless and largely invisible. Daytime fluff moves to afternoon updates and talk, which then gives way to the evening's hard news, which in turn then flows into celebrity programming, all within the space of hours. Close quote. People aren't being informed, they're just being distracted by information that does not matter. It's one of the biggest contributors not only to America's social and political divide, but even more so our being uninformed. Quote, experts face a vexing challenge. There's more news available, and yet people seem less informed, a trend that goes back at least a quarter century. Paradoxically, it is a problem that is worsening rather than dissipating. Not only do people know less about the world around them, they are less interested in it, despite the availability of more information than ever before. As long ago as 1990, for example, a study conducted by the Pew Trust warned that disengagement from important public questions was actually worse among people under 30, the group that should have been most receptive to then emerging sources of information like cable television and electronic media. Close quote. This makes sense, given the fact that people will mainly listen to information that directly affects them and discard other information. Thus, connecting back to Nichols' earlier point about lay people's selfishness when it comes to being challenged intellectually. So it is clear that a combination of these issues has caused and furthered the disconnect between average people and experts. A disconnect that is dangerous, because, as Nichols states from the beginning of the book, both groups are necessary and have a purpose in society. Quote, experts have a responsibility to educate. Voters have a responsibility to learn. In the end, regardless of how much advice the professionals might provide, only the public can decide the direction of the important policy choices facing their nation. Only voters can resolve among the choices that affect their families and for their country, and only they bear the ultimate responsibility for those decisions. But the experts have an obligation to help. Close quote. Without experts, society would not be able to solve complex problems on its own. Quote, if lay people refuse to take their duties as citizens seriously and do not educate themselves about issues important to them, democracy will mutate into technocracy. The rule of experts, so feared by lay people, will grow by default. Close quote. We need experts who are experienced in those problems to find solutions. We need everyday citizens to collaborate with them in order to make those solutions a reality. Because diversity in people's thoughts and beliefs is the foundation of a democracy. If every citizen had the same personality, creativity would be non-existent. If everyone agreed with each other, no significant social changes would be made. In order for us to become a genuine democracy again, we need to take a step back and evaluate our current situation. We need to start acknowledging our flaws, mistakes, and problems, then take steps to correct them. But of course, we can't do that individually. We must do it together. That's the whole purpose of collaboration. If we help each other rather than fight each other, the solution will become much clearer and the process will be much easier. We must acknowledge the reality that not everyone agrees with each other. It's impossible to please everybody, and that's okay. We don't have to see eye to eye, but at the very least, we should hear each other out. But in order to do so, we must put our biases aside, because biases are what are the contributors to unsolvable arguments. Quote, we all suffer from problems, for example, like confirmation bias, the natural tendency only to accept evidence that confirms what we already believe. Close quote. It is our biases that prevent us from learning, from acknowledging opposing viewpoints and facts. We're all guilty of it. But we can change and improve. The first step is admitting the problem exists.